Today, mortgage stress hits another high. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news. Well, today I want to walk you through the latest from my model up to the end of May relating to mortgage stress. Before I start, let me just explain a little bit about how we do the calculations. So our market model is driven by a continuous household survey. We actually survey 1,000 households each week, which makes 52,000 households each year. And it's updated every month, taking account of the latest information from our surveys and also the broader information coming from places like the RBA and the ABS and other economic data. So this gives us a very good view of what's going on the ground. And the reason this is so important is because we have to get granular to really see the differences between different types of households and how mortgage stress and rental stress is actually impacting real households at a granular level. Which takes us to the definition of stress. And it's worth saying, I think, that there are many different ways of defining stress. Some say 30% of income or taxable income, through to various underwriting metrics. But we define stress in cash flow terms, money in, money out. So if households have more outgoings, excluding one-off discretionary items and income, we define them as stress. If they have a mortgage, then they're in mortgage stress. If renting, then they're in rental stress. And we can also look at the investor sets too. And if they have cash flow pressures or indeed are trying to sell, we classify them as stressed property investors. And we can also aggregate the data to estimate the total financial stress. And we can express each as a percentage of households and account. The latter is best simply because you could have a very small household count with a very high level of stress, but it gives you the wrong sense of the real impact more broadly. Whereas if you have a high percentage of households in a large count, then we know we've got a real issue. So now let's look at the overall results for May 2023. And what we first of all look at is the trend information. So rental stress has accelerated up again, and 62.01% of households renting are in rental stress, which is actually another peak. We've also seen mortgage stress rise to 48.4% of borrowing households, and that's another peak. And just for comparisons, before COVID, we had 32.9% of borrowing households in mortgage stress, so there's been a considerable increase. We can also take account of what the RBA is saying in terms of the household debt ratio. Debt to income ratio is 187.8%, but that of course includes households who are not borrowing. So the true number is probably about triple that. So here is the information for May relating to the overall analysis at a state level. And you can see here that the state with the highest level of stress is still Tasmania at 56.2, down very slightly this month. But we've also seen increases, and by the way, where we've highlighted in yellow, there's an increase compared to last month. So for example, in Victoria, we're up at 51.5% now. In South Australia, we're at 50.88%. In New South Wales, at 48.42%. And the overall grand total is 48.36%. Looking at rental stress, you can see here that, again, it varies across the states, but rental stress is up again in the ACT, slightly down in New South Wales, slightly up in the Northern Territories, slightly down in Queensland, up in South Australia, slightly down in Tasmania, slightly up in Victoria, and up in Western Australia, giving a 62.01% of those in rental stress. Or, if you prefer a count, that's 1.922 million in rental stress, compared with 1.85 million in mortgage stress. Stressed investors continue to rise across the board pretty much. There was a slight reduction in New South Wales and the Northern Territories, and that's explained by some investors refinancing to slightly lower mortgage rates, as well as significant rental increases being imposed on those who are renting. Overall, 21.93% of investors are stressed, which is 641,000 stressed investors. And we can take an aggregate view which looks at the combination of mortgage, rental and investor stress. And there, the total is 45.27%, which is 4.4 million households out of 9.7 million. And you can see here that there are some various differences across the states. 49.27% in New South Wales in financial stress, 44% in Victoria, and 45% in Western Australia. I also want to highlight that the ACT has 47.88%. Now, the ACT, of course, is a more variable set because the total number of households are lower, and that can lead us to see some variations month on month. Nevertheless, this is a very disturbing picture in my view because it shows that the pressure on households continues to rise, and of course that pressure is coming from a few different areas. Firstly, it's coming from higher rents for those in the rental sector, higher interest rates for those in the mortgage sector, and of course the cost of living, which is pretty much hitting everybody. And whilst there has been some improvement in terms of income, the truth is that more households are finding it harder and harder to balance income and expenditure. So more are hunkering down, cutting back, and of course getting into more difficulty the longer it goes on. And also we're seeing a continued rise now in access to additional credit, be that buy now, pay later, or credit cards, or other forms of loans. And it's worth saying again that while some households still have significant buffers, that's because of course they were saving over the last 2 or 3 years, those buffers have been depleted, especially with those with a mortgage and a rental stress problem. And so the distribution is very unequal across the country and across different household segments. Which takes us to our next analysis, because we can also look at the analysis by different segments. And this is where we start getting to understand that not all household groups are equally impacted. So, for example, if you look at young growing families, which include a lot of first-time buyers, you can see that the mortgage stress number is now up again to 88.97%, which relates to about 296,000 first-time buyers and young growing families in mortgage stress. 65.9% of them also have rental stress, and overall financial stress amongst young growing families is 66.4%, which is around 483,000 households. Among the young affluents, they're much more protected from a mortgage stress perspective, but they have been exposed because of bad investment decisions, and so investor stress is very high. And overall financial stress is at 52%. If we look at the battling urban and disadvantaged fringe segments, now they are the ones on the outskirts of town, often with limited incomes, quite often in the high growth areas, and quite exposed, therefore, to what's been going on with mortgage rates. So the battling urban group has a mortgage stress level of 78.7%, and that translates to about 135,000 in mortgage stress. Whereas the disadvantaged fringe, so these are the ones on the outskirts of town, 72.2% or 487,000 households in mortgage stress. Now, we can also note that the multicultural establishment group, which is the first generation migrants to Australia, are also feeling it. And 44.1% of them have mortgage stress exposure, that's about 95,000, but 70% or 163,000 have rental stress exposure. And therefore, in the round, overall financial stress is above 50% for that particular group. And in summary, if you're looking at young growing families, including first-time buyers, first-generation Australians, new migrants, and those on the edge of town, the battling urban, more than half of all those are also exposed, and you can also add in young affluents who are also feeling it too. Now we can then quickly go through the main postcode. So this is sorted by the total number of households on this sheet in mortgage stress. So the postcode with the highest level of mortgage stress in terms of count, more than 12,200, is in Campbelltown, postcode 2560 in New South Wales. Then comes Liverpool, postcode 2170 with more than 12,000. And then we go to Western Australia, postcode 6065 with more than 11,500. And then to Toowoomba with more than 11,000. That's postcode 4350. And then we come back to Victorian postcode 3064, including Roxburgh Park and Donnybrook, and also Narre Warren and Fountain Gate, postcode 3805, and Berwick and Harkaway, postcode 3806. All of these postcodes here are also high growth corridors, a lot of new developments, a lot of new first time buyers, and a lot of new builds still underway. And you can add Pakenham and Upper Pakenham into that as well. Then we come back to New South Wales with more than 9,000 in and around Camden. And then we go to Riverston and Marsden Park in New South Wales, postcode 2765. And then we go to regional areas again like Ballarat, postcode 3350, where again we are seeing a lot of high growth activity, particularly lots of new first-time buyers. Then we come back to another high growth area in Victoria, postcode 3029, including Hoppers Crossing and Tarneit, and Point Coot and Werribee, postcode 3030, and then Western Australian postcode 6030 with more than 7,000 households in mortgage stress. So you can see the significant concentration and the characteristics of those particular postcodes. We can then look at the rental stress story, and here Melbourne postcode 3000 is right at the top with more than 12,800 households in rental stress. Then we go to Liverpool in New South Wales, postcode 2170, and Toowoomba, postcode 4350, with very high counts again. And then we go to New South Wales, postcode 2145, Wentworthville, that includes Greystanes and Westmead, and then Mount Druitt, Lethbridge Park, and places in that area, postcode 2770, another high stress area with more than 8,800 households. Then we go up to Queensland and the area around Southport and Labrador, postcode 4215. Then back to New South Wales, postcode 2017, Zetland, Waterloo, with more than 8,800. And then Hoppers Crossing and Tarneit in Victoria, postcode 3029. Then Campbelltown, New South Wales, postcode 2560. And then we go to Bundaberg, Ipswich, and back to Blacktown in New South Wales, and then Gosford on the Central Coast with more than 7,800. Then another high growth corridor area in Victoria, postcode 3064, including Craigieburn and Donnybrook, and up to Queensland with Highgate Hill, South Brisbane, the West End, postcode 4101. And even there, we've got more than 7,000 households in rental stress. And you'll notice the commonality between high levels of rental stress and high levels of mortgage stress. Some of the postcodes keep popping up. Then we'll look at stressed investors. And here we find that the Northern Beaches, places like Narrabeen, for example, postcode 2065, are at the top of the list. Then centres of Melbourne. Then we go to Wentworthville. And then we go to Southport, Labrador in Queensland, postcode 4215. Then Strathfield towards the west of Sydney, 2135. And up in Queensland, the Fortitude Valley, postcode 4006. And McDowell, postcode 4053. Then Bundaberg again, 4670. Then we go to Cranbourne in Victoria. And then we go to the large postcode 4570, which includes Coles Creek, Downsfield, Jones Hill, a lot of small areas, but all adding up. Then we go to Matraville in New South Wales, postcode 2036, Upper Coomera and Coomera in Queensland, 4209, and then another Queensland postcode 4655, which includes Cranenish and Eli Waters, and postcode 3006, which includes South Bank in Victoria. Now, the total numbers of stressed investors, of course, are quite low, but nevertheless significant. And what's happening here is that many are being caught in a pincer movement. Whilst they're trying to put rents up, the costs of their mortgage are rising faster. And when you add all the other costs of managing investment property into the mix and the new regulations, more people are actually looking to exit. And finally, we'll go to look at financial stress, which is the aggregate level. And here, what we're seeing is that at the aggregate level, postcode 2170, that's Liverpool, with more than 24,700 households, has the prize for the most financially stressed postcode. Then second on the list is Toowoomba, postcode 4350 with more than 24,500. Campbelltown, postcode 2560 with more than 23,000. Victorian postcode 3064, Roxburgh Park and Donnybrook, followed by Tarneet, Hoppers Crossing, postcode 3029, and the centre of Melbourne, postcode 3000. Then we come back to New South Wales with Mount Druitt, Lethbridge Park, postcode 2770, and we go up to Ipswich with postcode 4305, and then back to Victoria, Point Cook and Werribee, and then we come to New South Wales postcode 2145, including Westmead and Wentworthville. Then we go to Western Australian postcode 6065, Tapping, back to regional postcode 3350 at Ballarat, and then those high growth corridors at Pakenham, postcode 3810, and around the Blacktown area, postcode 2148. Then up to Queensland, Labrador, Southport, postcode 4215, and Springfield, postcode 4300, and Coomera, postcode 4209. And just off the bottom there is Narre Warren, another high growth corridor in Victoria. Now, the point I want to make here is that we are seeing considerable pressure on households in some of these areas. And my estimation is that as interest rates continue to rise, as I expect, we will see more households in these areas getting into difficulty. Now, mortgage stress is not the same as defaults, of course, because what happens is that people can hunker down, spend less, perhaps tap into savings, perhaps grab additional credit, perhaps refinance and grab equity from the property. And banks are at the moment being very generous in their underwriting standards, and so they're helping people refinance onto longer term loans, which means that the monthly repayments are lower, but of course the total interest bill is a lot higher. But the point I want to make here is that the analysis shows that there is really no get out of jail card at the moment, because it's very unlikely that we're going to see incomes in real terms accelerate, not least of course because of the high migration. And whilst the Fair Work Commission awards will help some households, really it's hardly going to touch the sides. And even the government support programs that was announced through the budget, again, very limited and relatively unimportant in terms of easing mortgage stress. So the question is, how do you handle the situation if you have difficulty? Well, as I've said several times, it's very important to build a cash flow, understand where the money is coming from and where is it going to, and then you can select and prioritize. Many households in my surveys don't understand this yet. And in fact, if you look at the ASIC Smart Money website, they have a good set of tools which can help with this. Once you've prioritized, it's then important to change your behavior. I know it's difficult, but things like multiple streaming services, very expensive mobile phone plans, those sorts of things are the easy targets. Then you need to look at other expenditure profiles too, because of course what people are doing is prioritizing the mortgage or the rent over other things. Unfortunately, this means that in some cases we're seeing households going without meals, going without medical attention and treatment that they should have, and frankly, just hunkering down. I'd also make the point that it's very significant that households over time get themselves into a tangle, and the longer they leave it, the more of a tangle they get into. So it's worth trying to address this relatively early. So don't put your head in the sand and just assume that things will magically work out. The settings we have in the economy at the moment would suggest to me that mortgage stress and rental stress is going to continue to bite, and bite hard, not just over a few months, but over the next 2 or 3 years. And I will make this point, that the expectation that the RBA will suddenly drop rates later in the year, well, if you're holding on to that as a get-out-of-jail card, I think you're probably fooling yourself. And of course, some media commentators are also fooling you too, because that's what they're arguing. The RBA is quite clear they're going to tackle inflation. Inflation won't come back into band until 24, 25, and therefore interest rates are more likely to go up and stay high over the next little while. This is not a good news story, of course, but it is important that people take account of what we're seeing here and plan accordingly. And by the way, a word of warning, if you are thinking of getting help with regard to budgeting or debt management, it's very important that you don't just Google them on the internet, because a lot of the people who are offering, quote, services, unquote, are doing it to generate income for themselves rather than helping households. But the good news is there is, of course, the National Debt Helpline, 1-800-0707, which actually can assist. That's a government service. They're very busy at the moment, but nevertheless, it's worth taking a note of that. So I'll update the information next month, and I suspect that we will continue to see the mortgage trends going adverse. So I'll update this again next month. I do expect to see continued stress in the system for some long time yet. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.